good afternoon. My name is Soumya. I hope all of you can hear me. And it would be great if everyone could have their cameras on. Um, Thank you. I'm a volunteer at In Dialogue Foundation, and I was also a student in the first batch. So, uh, and currently I'm working in education. So today it's a pleasure to welcome Venugopal sir. I had taken his lecture before also, and so it's very exciting to attend this again because there was a lot of details that I missed. Anyway, the lecture is about dialogue, democracy, and rights. And so something about Venugopal Maddipati. He's a PhD from University of Minnesota and is an architectural historian teaching in the School of Design at Ambedkar University, Delhi. His research focuses on geological thinking and ecological histories. His publications include the book titled Water Histories of South Asia, The Materiality of Liquescence, co-edited with Sugata Ray at University of California, Berkeley, and Gandhi and Architecture, A Time for Low-Cost Housing, and essays and journals, books such as South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, Sarai Reader, Simone Starling, Triangulations and Road Tests, and LA Journal of Landscape Architecture. He is currently writing a book on ecological aesthetics and the social imagery in South Asia. This book is centered around the theme of mimesis. So, a lot of terms that I did not understand. Hopefully, we'll get to learn about them today. Sir, it's a pleasure to welcome you. And today you have 2 hours for this session. For the first hour, it could be lecture, and the second hour you could take questions, if that's.
Yeah, that should be fine, actually. Thank you so much. So I don't know if I'll be able to cover quite a few of the terms that are there as a part of my my abstract. But actually, I'm really only going to talk about a few concepts today. And I think I shared some readings on Gandhi with the students, I think through Bezad. So, and I think I wanted to actually try and draw attention, especially because it's a question of dialogue. The idea of dialogue fundamentally involves a basic presupposition. And I'm going to try and keep it simple, and I'll also try and get into some concepts in terms of political thought. And again, some of you might have a background in political thinking and political science. So if this sounds familiar, you'll have to bear with me. And I'll try and move in a very specific way towards the question of politics. But I think, so coming back to the question of dialogue, and I think one basic precondition or a presupposition of dialogue, at least insofar as we understand it in a philosophical sense or even in a political sense, is the question of vulnerability, which is to say that to be able to communicate and exchange thoughts with somebody else, we need to be in a position to open our minds to the thoughts of the other. And we need to be making ourselves vulnerable to the thoughts of the other. Now that's a very simple way of, I'm sure there are many other ways in which we can actually think and theorize and philosophize dialogue. But if we were to ask this question as to what does this idea of vulnerability mean in the context of dialogue and even in the context of, say, something like friendship, and I think that's part of the direction. That's mostly the direction actually, that I want to move towards in this brief conversation. And the thinker that we're actually going to draw on to consider this question is Gandhi, who is, as we all witness today, um, um, seen as being problematic for a variety of reasons, and at the same time, who is, and so is justifiably criticized for a number of reasons, and is also in some ways seen as a defender of certain values, which we all, not all, but again, don't want to generalize, but many of us would uh, would would imagine as being important to our understanding of the world and political society. So I think this is not really a kind of a valorization or a celebration of Gandhi as much as it is an attempt at thinking along with Gandhi. Um, to make ourselves vulnerable, so I'm using the word again, vulnerable, to Gandhi's thinking, which means to be in dialogue with Gandhi, but at the same time, to imagine the opposite as well, to be open to the possibility that there is much that needs to be questioned about Gandhi and his thinking. So I think it's in that light I want to go ahead. So it's in a certain sense a conversation with Gandhi, a dialogue with Gandhi without Gandhi being here to actually defend himself. But even so, in the spirit of a dialogue, let's start this conversation. So I think if we understand this question of vulnerability as being central to the idea of dialogue, uh, we will have to first of all take a look at this word more carefully, which is vulnerability. Now, the moment we think of vulnerability, we also think of its opposite word, which is invulnerability, right? So, which means that on the one hand, uh, as human beings, we'd like to sort of not in the normal circumstances make ourselves vulnerable to anything. Most of our life struggles are about securitizing ourselves, making ourselves invulnerable to perhaps circumstances, be they environmental, social, or economic around us, right? Most of us as human beings are constantly struggling to sort of to pull ourselves away from states of vulnerability, because that's not a happy state to be in. I mean, that's how we are mostly socialized into thinking. And in that sense, we imagine that most of our efforts, most of our social and political and legal institutions in society are also created with an eye towards ensuring that we don't become vulnerable. Something protects us. I mean, we try and protect ourselves as much as a lot of social institutions are created by us collectively, or have been historically created by our various societies and nationalities to which we belong, to ensure that we are not vulnerable. Now, it's in this light that we have to understand a certain form of institutionalization, which we understand today, as perhaps some of you might be political scientists, a certain category called liberalism, right? So if we actually try to understand the idea of liberalism, I mean, there's a history to it. I'm not sure if you've heard of this thinker called John Locke. So Locke is like seen as this one person who is some sort of a founding figure in this idea and this tradition of liberalism. And John Locke's idea of liberalism is basically that if human beings were to live in a state of nature by themselves, without any government, without any kinds of rules and obligations, they'll do just fine, right? So why? Because human beings are innately capable of being free and independent. So the thought is one which is capable of doing good things, right? So in order to protect this freedom of human beings to be themselves, only you will need a government, which goes to say that the government is not there to take away freedoms, from human beings, as much as government exists and comes into existence to actually protect the freedoms of human beings, right? That's a very basic, central, straightforward tenet of most political philosophy as we know it, which is drawing from a liberal core. So, which means then that, when we think about, liberalism, we think that, let's say, a constitution exists, right? When we think of a constitution, we're thinking of Dr. Ambedkar, who's written a constitution in India, for instance. A constitution exists to ensure that each of us is guaranteed certain basic minimum freedoms, right? And in this guaranteeing of freedoms, a new term comes into existence, which is liberty. So when we actually start talking about constitutions, we actually talk about liberties, right? Constitutional guarantees of certain basic liberties that we all have, right? Insofar as we are in a constitutional, a country with a constitution. Now, this idea that has a long history coming from John Locke, and then also it goes into the thinking of certain other philosophers, German idealists like Immanuel Kant. In this entire idea of liberty, which is ensured through, let's say, government or through some external agency, the basic idea is that the human being is a fundamentally good being, and is actually the most valuable thing about every human being is his or her freedom, right? The freedom to be what they want to be, the freedom to do what they want to do, right? And if a government has to come into existence, and this is what, you can actually look this up, something called the Lockean social contract. If it has to come into existence, it has to come into existence to protect these basic freedoms that every human being inherently has and wishes to exercise. So in that sense, even if a government uses force, right? Even if a government, uses its police arm, it will only do so to protect freedoms. It will not take action to take away freedoms. Rather, it will use force to protect freedoms, right? So this is a very basic tenet of how we understand a liberal society, where everybody has freedom, and that freedom to do what you want to do is protected constitutionally. However, in this entire picture, there is one extra element which we also have to consider, which means that if you, as a free human being who does exactly what you want to do, who are free, right? You exercise your full freedom. You cannot infringe upon somebody else's freedom, right? That's also part of being a part of a constitutional society, right? That the constitution is also asking you, hey, please don't intrude into somebody else's freedom or reduce somebody else's freedom, right? So in this entire exercise, one of the words that we use when we oftentimes talk about liberty, not freedom. There's a difference between liberty and freedom. Freedom is without constitution, and liberty is when you start actually trying to give people the ability to exercise their free will using constitutional means or some kind of a legal scaffolding, right? So when you actually allowing people to use their own will, right, and not impose your will upon them, you're also asking people to be very careful. You're saying, "Acha, you guys, please go ahead and exercise your will, but please make sure that your will does not intrude upon somebody else's will. Just because you want to do something, it should not take away somebody else's ability to self-will their own choices, right?" So this idea of will is very important. Self-will is very important. But in this conception of liberty, which ensures that you have your own will, there is also a negative component, not just a positive component, which means a positive meaning that you can go ahead and exercise your will, right? So that's a positive component, that every one of us has a positive ability to go and do exactly what we want to do. And the state has to protect that, or somebody has to protect that. The negative component is it's a kind of a it's a kind of a pressure on you that you have a negative liberty as well, which means that you are not supposed to take somebody else's liberty away. You're supposed to not take somebody else's will away from them, right? And this is where you start seeing something like basic rights come into existence, right? Every one of us has a bundle of rights which accrue to us because we are a part of a constitutional republic, right? And the Constitution's very task is to ensure that no one of us can take away the constitutionally guaranteed rights of the other, right? Which means you're not, by constitutional terms, not to take away the will of others. You exercise your own will, but only insofar as your will is not going to hurt somebody else's sense of will, right? So there's a positive component also and a negative component also. So this is a very important way in which we understand liberalism. And for the most part, I think when we talk about liberalism in the present, when civil society keeps emphasizing liberalism, when we talk about the constitution, the rule of law, we're talking about laws which are protecting our freedoms, right? And if at all a police force exists, or if at all a state exists, if at all a judiciary exists, they're all doing this hard work of ensuring that our basic constitutional freedoms are there with us and nobody can take them away from us, because that's what being a part of society in a legal and constitutional sense is, right? In a statutory sense. Now, this is where a variety of problems also start emerging. The first set of questions comes within liberalism itself, right? Some people say, well, to be able to have these basic rights that are guaranteed to you, the right to exercise your own will, the right to have your own freedoms, the right to privacy, right? All of these various rights that we can imagine, the right to livelihood, so many different kinds of rights. They will only accrue to you if you are a citizen. Now that's an important point, right? And which means that if you can't prove your citizenship, if you can't show that you are, a citizen in any sense of the word, the citizen, then what happens to you? Do you have those rights, right? Who guarantees the right of your need to exist, the right of your need to have freedom, right? So there is a huge debate that comes up in this area in a variety of ways, which is that, for instance, and especially this is where, for instance, some of my students, which we work on housing rights, right? For instance, so the question comes up that if you, for instance, don't have property, right, you're seen to not necessarily be a full citizen, right? So if you actually look at the Lockean social contract, in that contract, the first and most important thing is that you must own property, right? So property bearing citizens generally end up having a greater say in public affairs and in constitutional terms, because those who don't have property or proof of property oftentimes don't seem to get that much of a say, which is why when you actually see in the cities that we live in, the RWAs, which are mostly resident welfare associations representing property owners, seem to have a far greater say in the way in which the city should develop than, say, those who are living in slums, because they are supposedly illegal and they don't have the property proof, or they don't have any way of proof of address. So that you can see these disparities that begin to emerge even in this idea of liberalism as we know it. So there is a huge critique of liberalism from this perspective. There are other forms of criticism too for liberalism, and I think for that other form of criticism, which actually focuses on what I've just suggested, is mostly trying to be internal to the idea of liberalism, saying that liberalism is not liberal enough because it's not really reaching out to everybody, right? But there's a slightly different perspective, which says that, can we think outside of liberalism, right? And that's where the question of thinkers like Gandhi come up. Now, Gandhi is conservative, right? We got to be very clear about this. And why he is conservative and what specific ways is he conservative is something which we need to understand. And it also will be helpful because the objective here is not to understand Gandhi alone as much as it's to understand liberalism, right? And we can't give up on liberalism. I mean, it has all of these flaws, but it's the only thing we have right now, and so we need to probably draw on traditions outside liberalism to return to liberalism, not to sort of, dump liberalism. I mean, that's not what we're trying to do here. So, as I said, liberalism has certain positive conceptions of liberty and certain negative conceptions of liberty, right? Now, if you look at the negative conception, you're saying that you do certain things, but don't do certain other things which will take away the rights and the freedoms of the other, right? So that's something which I said earlier on. Now, in order to do that, liberalism, or at least let's say a constitution, has to take a certain path. It has to very clearly identify what liberty or freedom is, right? Which means that it literally decides the liberty or the freedom to do this, right? So in that sense, there's a very rational way in which we can actually enumerate the kinds of rights we have and the precise ways in which we can use our freedoms and liberties, and the precise ways in which we can't use them, right? So which means that liberalism, insofar as it is a constitutional conception of liberalism, is saying that we are all equal. If you're citizens in this country, you're all equal citizens. Every citizen is equal to everybody else. But how are you equal? You're equal because of such and such things, such and such rights. As a citizen, each of you are equal because each of you has a right to livelihood. Each of you has a right to health, right? So there's certain basic rights which ensure that we are all equal, right? So which means that the Constitution treats us all as the same, right? We're all equal and therefore we're all the same. We're all equal because we all have these exact same rights that should be accruing to us, right? Now, this is where this idea of equality coming from a liberal conception of, let's say, constitutionalism is fantastic because it ensures that there is equality between all of us, but it also presents certain challenges because from, let's just say, Gandhi's perspective, what this leads to is towards liberalism, or sorry, an equality of what, which is different from an equality of who. Okay, and that's the key point we want to get at. So which means that when we think about freedom, right, and freedom has a huge history which is there even from before John Locke, right? In Western tradition, freedom is a very beautiful word. I mean, it has it can be interpreted in a number of different ways. But one of the key ideas of freedom also partly comes up from, let's say, a history that is tied in with the church, right? In the Western tradition. So when we say freedom, we're saying that we want to be free from, and even God has to be free. I mean, if you actually go back into the idea of freedom and you try and tie it with the idea of, let's say, a divine being, we think, well, supposing if you were to look at, I'm not again pointing towards any one religion, I'm just saying, let's just think of an abstract religion, any abstract religion, where there is a divine being who creates the universe. So again, as I want to be very clear, I'm not referring to any one religion. This is an abstract imaginary religion, okay? And this divine being wants to create this universe. What will be the principles by which this divine being will create this universe, right? Now, if this divine being says, I'm going to create all of this universe based upon certain principles, then it creates a theological problem. What is a theological? I don't want to use it. Let's say not a theological. It creates a simple logical problem. Sure, we'll come to these questions. We'll come to these questions. So I'm just saying that the logical problem this presents is that if this divine being is creating the universe based upon certain principles, then the principles must pre-exist this divine being, right? Like if this divine being says how to create this universe, I'm going to look up a guidebook to create this universe, then the guidebook must pre-exist the divine being, right? Logically. So which then means that the divine being is not so powerful, that even before the divine being, there is some other greater force which is more powerful, which has created the guidebook or the set of principles by which this divine being is going to create this universe, right? So if now that's a logical problem. And what you find in the history of religion is that this problem is constantly being grappled with. That if God has created this universe, did God create this universe sui generis, which is without referring to any pre-existing principle, or did God refer back to something else that existed before God, right? And so if God has created this universe sui generis, which is created without referring to any pre-existing principle, then God has acted with freedom. That is freedom. Freedom is the ability to act without reference to any pre-existing concept or pre-existing rule, right? So that is what you call a radical freedom, a freedom that cannot be referred back to anything that comes before. That is why you're free. To be free is to be able to do what nobody has been telling you to do, right? To be free is to be able to use your freedom to do something wholly new, which you have never done before. If you're not doing that, you're not free. You're again falling back into an older pattern, right? So what applies to the God or this divine being in this abstract religion also applies to political conceptions of freedom. That we have to be free, we have to be free to do something without referring back to anything else before. So which brings us back to the idea of freedom and liberty in the Constitution, right? When the Constitution or when any sort of legal sort of contract, social contract is saying that you are free or you have liberty, it's not saying you're free to do anything you want. Please notice. It is saying that you have such and such freedoms, which ensure that because everybody else in this country has those other freedoms, you're all equal, right? So this is a very important point to understand. So when we're actually talking about constitutional freedoms, the Constitution is not saying you're God. It's not saying that as a God you can do anything you want. It's asking you to think that if you think you're God and you can do anything you want, then you need to measure whether doing what you want to do is actually going to hurt somebody else. And then you will automatically correct yourself to not do those things which are hurting others, right? So which means that this is a slightly more restricted conception. Liberty is a slightly restricted conception of freedom in the way in which we were describing it in that abstract religion we were talking about. So liberalism is really about protecting your liberties, not about that idea of a godlike freedom, right? We have to be very clear about this. But at the same time, so which means that when we're actually talking about liberty, which is different from freedom, freedom is also without fear, right? Because if there is any fear in the being, in this abstract being, while they're creating something, that means they're not really free. If they're afraid of something, if they're trying to follow certain rules to create the universe, then that means already there is some greater being of which they are afraid, right? So therefore, freedom is without fear, but liberty has a little bit of fear in it. You're afraid of the government, it'll come and punish you if you become a godlike being and start doing exactly what you want to do, right? You're afraid of stepping onto somebody else's shoes by exercising your own freedom. You stay within your limits, right? So there is an element of fear in that, right? So essentially what we rely upon when we look at the Constitution, or we look at, let's say, this idea of the social contract, the liberal social contract, we're saying that all of us are protecting ourselves. We are protecting our right to be having liberty, right? So if the police exists, it is a police force that is being used to protect your basic constitutional rights, right? So the very idea of having a constitution is to securitize your rights, which is to make you invulnerable, to protect you, right? Because by adhering to the constitution, all the citizens of this country ensure that nobody feels vulnerable when it comes to some very basic, specific rights, right? This much to right you have in this country. Nobody can take that away from you. Why? Well, the constitution says so, and if you don't want to read the constitution, the police will come and tell you something like that. Those kinds of things we understand. Now, in this conception, what happens is that because we make ourselves invulnerable, right? We also forget what it's like to be vulnerable, right? So when you're, for instance, talking to somebody else, and coming back to the question of dialogue, all our dialogues are taking place within the umbrella of liberty in this conception, right? When I'm actually speaking to you, I'm not going to say anything which is going to make you feel vulnerable. Why? Because there is a constitution, there is law, and I cannot say anything which will offend you beyond a certain point, and I should not, and therefore in our very social interactions, liberalism and constitutionality is a part of our very idea of conversation, right? When somebody steps beyond those boundaries, we have problems. The law comes in, the government comes in, the state comes in, and all sorts of things happen. And that's great. I mean, that's good, because we need certain ways in which we protect each other from each other. We can harm each other, right? We can cause great distress, pain, suffering to each other. As human beings, we are capable of all of these things. But at the same time, what happens to dialogue? Because in dialogue, if we are reduced to this, then we are only talking to somebody who's equal to us in a very specific sense. We're only recognizing one part of the other, right? We're not looking at the entire dimension of that other person, right? Because we're too scared of getting into that dimension, because to do so will be to infringe into the rights of that other person, right? And this is where liberalism, even as it actually is our most stable and most reliable way of ensuring that we have civil conversation, also reduces the ability to actually engage at one level, where somebody who's not like us, somebody who doesn't have our political beliefs, somebody who thinks radically differently, somebody from a different religion, somebody from a different, let's just say, society, somebody from a different belief system, right? Because we all follow the constitution together, we stay within certain limits while talking to each other, and we therefore don't infringe into those areas which will cause, where we might have fundamental differences, where you and I may not agree at all, but we not go too far down that road, because we're going to hurt the other, or we'll get hurt ourselves, right? So in liberalism, the entire edifice of liberalism and the idea of rights is fundamentally there to protect us, which is great. But in the process, we also securitize ourselves, right? And the conversation between two securitized beings is a lot less free in comparison to a conversation between two beings who are vulnerable to each other, right? And this is where, for instance, when you actually look at a figure like Gandhi, what's very interesting is that Gandhi is a lawyer himself, right? So he understands constitutionality. This is a person who's actually worked as a lawyer in South Africa. He understands exactly every single thing that we've said thus far. That's his profession, right? And here's a person then who goes against law, right? In fact, the very idea of looking for freedom, right, asking for liberty or freedom, right, against British rule, is principally to, first of all, go against law, right? And at the second level, he also insists on certain categories and terms like, satyagraha or swaraj, right? Which is a certain kind of a notion of freedom, right? But in his conception of freedom, if you actually read this very important text, yes, absolutely, absolutely. And that's the most important thing to understand, that like vulnerability is something we don't want to put ourselves into, right? But the point is, then how do you reach out to those who are having the most horrid thoughts, right, which are very different from yours, without making yourselves vulnerable to them? Because if we keep securitizing ourselves, we are only seeing little caricatures of each other, right? Now, beyond that is the world where the most dangerous thoughts lie, right? Without actually seeing that side of others, how will we be able to make friends with them? How will we be able to change their way of thinking? Right? That's the most challenging thing, right? Because on the one hand, we want to be protected. We don't want to be vulnerable. Nobody wants to be vulnerable, right? On social media, so many people make themselves vulnerable, right? And these days, I think a lot of people are very vulnerable. But and perhaps one part of that idea of making yourselves vulnerable is to actually have a dialogue, right? To not sort of keep yourself in your own echo chamber. But for the most part, we still are very cautious when it comes to this question of vulnerability. So I think with Gandhi, what you see is that he is, even though somebody who's fundamentally trained in law, and at least in the Pax Britannica, which is what was there in South Asia at that time, is somebody who is not talking about freedom purely in the sense of becoming a parliamentary democracy, which is a constitution-bound democracy. So if you actually read Hind Swaraj, is a very important text which he writes in 1907 and 8. He's talking about something much bigger than this. He's saying that what about freedom in that God-like sense, right? He's not saying that, but and he's saying that to be able to be free like that, right? It also means to be vulnerable, to be able to be free from all encumbrances like these laws, and to put yourself out there and to do exactly what you want to do in conversation with somebody else, but also to be open to that other person's sense of freedom in the purest sense, right? That's something which is an ideal, but it's not possible to have that because we can't trust human beings enough. Who knows what they'll do, right? So I think this question is that Gandhi sort of shifts this question of the equality which we're talking about, which is an equality of what, in terms of what rights we all have between ourselves and therefore are equal, to a question of an equality of who, right? Which is a slightly more difficult and much more tough idea of equality. But in any case, I think the simple point I'm trying to raise is that what we're trying to look at is in what ways can, firstly, liberalism itself, while appreciable and exactly what we need, also locks us and securitizes us, right? Where we will only have certain restricted ways of communicating with each other. And to that end, liberalism, while it is a guarantor for our ability to speak with each other, because it automatically protects us from each other even before we start speaking, also, in some ways, does not allow conversation to go to another level. And I think that's something that, looking at somebody like Gandhi might be helpful. So I think I'll just keep the conversation at this stage, and maybe we can actually try and take it into perhaps in some form of a conversational mode. Um, and of course, I had sort of anticipated this conversation on Gandhi again, also in the light of a lot of the things that we're seeing around ourselves these days. I mean, he is criticized, but not just him. I mean, there's a lot of other things happening. And interestingly enough, insofar as we find anything that he says meaningful, uh, one way of moving past these moments also is to revert to this idea of making yourselves vulnerable, to actually have conversations with people who are not like ourselves, and to try and actually engage in a dialogue which is not restricted to simply uttering the same old thing, right? That we have to move towards conversation rather than, and because if we keep securitizing ourselves more and more, right, where we only talk about a certain few sets of things, then the only way in which we can actually reach a point where we can confront the ideas of others is through conflict, right? Because we've securitized ourselves so much that we're not willing to listen to anything else that falls out of it. And then we realize that the world we're living in is slipping away into that other realm, right? And we can only talk within this world in these restricted ways, right? And so that's where the challenge is, to actually understand dialogue and conversation, which will involve making ourselves vulnerable, to try and think past conflict and violence and war. And so that's the impossible kind of horizon. But I think in bits and pieces, we all probably are already doing that, right? So what's very interesting about something like this idea of equality of the who, or this notion of vulnerability, actually in everyday life, we all do exercise, or at least are making ourselves vulnerable. We don't make ourselves vulnerable in the public sphere, right? For instance, if on this particular platform, if you're having a conversation in a formal sense, or if you're employed somewhere in your workplaces, you are securitizing yourselves when you're speaking. You're very careful, you're weighing what you're going to say, and you're following certain protocols, right? And you're not infringing into anybody else's freedom or their liberty, right? You're very careful. But at home, oftentimes in the family, the convention is that your parents or your sisters, your siblings, or your children, they can say a lot of things to you which people from outside cannot, right? So there is a sharp difference between what you call a private sphere and a public sphere. So in the private sphere, it often does happen that we do make ourselves vulnerable, right? Where we can go into the most bitter arguments, where dialogue will take place in a way in which it cannot take place on Zoom, right? But then the problem with that idea of the household notion of invulnerability is that it also has a hierarchy within it. There you're not equal. Like your parents will be able to say certain things to you which you cannot, insofar as we follow certain patriarchal norms of hierarchy, right? So even in this question of the household notion of vulnerability, there is a certain core idea of inequality, right? So if we start reproducing the household as a way of talking to people outside, we will keep reproducing the inequalities in the household into public conversation, right? That's not what we want. Rather, we are talking about trying to sort of imagine a form of vulnerability which also transcends that inequality, right? And I think I'll leave it at that. I'll not go too far beyond. I think given you enough concepts, I think to make it more conceptual would be probably you'll start confusing. It's very simple though, I think, and because these are the realities of our everyday existence, insofar as we're citizens of some country, and insofar as we engage in dialogue, and insofar as we are bearers of rights. I think this much is something which is what I'm telling you is something which we all innately know, but I was just sort of bringing it out to the fore. So maybe we can have a few questions, I think, at this point, and have a quick dialogue, perhaps.
Yeah, right. Everyone, yeah. So George has raised hand.
Yes, please.
Sir, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah.
And my question is on the vulnerability and invulnerability. As you said, it has got two spheres, private and the public sphere. In private sphere, it has no problem. It can happen within my family, within my group. So I have no problem. But when it comes to a public sphere, for example, if I have to have a dialogue with a thief, do I have to have the same vulnerability of a thief to have a dialogue with him? I need some more clarity on this. What do you mean by getting into the invulnerability of the other?
I mean to say that See, we can't imagine a world without invulnerability. I'm not saying that we have to let go of liberalism, right? I'm not saying that we have to make ourselves vulnerable wholly to the thief. I'm only alerting us to how this securitization, without moments of opening to vulnerability, will ultimately produce conflict. Which is to say that if we purely go through a securitized understanding of the way we want to exercise our freedoms, we end up with situations where we don't know what others are thinking, right? And I think a huge part of conservative backlashes in a variety of societies right now is that a lot of people you might note from the older generation, my generation, or even older than me, would be saying that we have no idea what happened. Where did this all come from, right? And that's like as if like we have not been living, as if we've not been around long enough, as if we've not engaged long enough with society. But somewhere, people with very different thoughts and very different ideas from those who believe in liberalism have also sort of been growing in number. And then when it suddenly erupts in society and we see that difference, and you realize that perhaps conversations didn't really happen. Perhaps we had securitized ourselves so much that we didn't realize how people's minds were evolving and how ideas were changing and where people were going, and sometimes into the most dark spaces of thought. So I'm not saying that liberalism is bad or anything of that sort. I am a liberal. All I'm saying is that we also have to recognize the limits of liberalism. Liberalism cannot help us engage in dialogue. It can help protect us. But I think to be able to see beyond that, which is not to just see other citizens as equalities of what, right? But also as who are you, right? That difference is also important. So the idea of friendship, for instance, is a space where you're not talking about an equality of what. You're not friends with somebody because you are, constitutionally guaranteed equal rights. You're friends with somebody because you have made yourself vulnerable to that friend at some point in time, right? Or even the idea of love, right? I mean, in the conventional notion of love, again, in the political sense, a personal idea of it, of course, it is a part of making oneself vulnerable to somebody else, right? So again, that doesn't mean that you go and love the thief. And although Gandhi, interestingly, has written about the thief as well, we might take a look at that. But the point is that we also close the thief. We lock away the thief within a certain restricted conception of thievery, right? The thief is also a human being. However heinous or terrible the acts of the thief, that person is also more than his or her thievery. So to that extent, I'm not saying that we make ourselves vulnerable to that person, but to at least have that little thought that our entire socialization and the institutions within which we engage conceal those other dimensions of the other person. And that is something which I think, if you want to have a dialogue with the thief, you cannot have it through securitization. That you will have to at least temporarily or momentarily let down your guard. That's more than what can be expected from most of us, because none of us likes to be vulnerable in front of a thief or somebody who's violent. So I'm not advocating that. I'm only telling you that certainly making ourselves invulnerable will not, in the long term, it might lead us back to violence also, is part of the idea of what Gandhi is saying. And we may or may not agree with him wholly. He's very problematic. So I'm not advocating him as much as I'm saying that, like, how can we make more with liberalism than what we already have?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Pragya has also raised her hand.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I have comments and a question. One is about this thief and the just what you said about the thief and the possible. And there's this whole concept of restorative, which is sort of new in the West. Is the term in the West now?
What term?
Sort of being practiced.
What term? Is your voice cut?
Restorative justice.
Restorative justice.
Yeah. So, but it's been there in Buddhism and through Vipassana. They've done Vipassana camps in India. So that concept has been there, and I think a lot of that kind of makes you want to be vulnerable to the criminal, or and people have actually forgiven their rapists and people who killed their kin and kith as well. So that's also a concept. I don't know. I mean, it's a little. I think it's difficult, and I think needs a personal discipline at the core. So just wanted to comment on that. And next, as I'm going back to that part when I mentioned about walking on eggshells, for India-Pakistan peace and dialogue, and mostly, and in us of peace builders, what I've observed is there is this. They sort of don't want to rock the boat. So in the peace builders of India will absolutely refrain to comment on the problems of minorities in Pakistan, and in return, the Pakistani peace builders will say, hey, we should kind of not look at what is happening to the minorities in India, and we should sort of look inwards. So there's always this looking inwards, and what the rest of the world, the rest of the people who are not in the peace building community, they tend to call this sort of, one-sided thing, which they say that, it's sort of appeasement. It's like, we are just closing our eyes to what is. So I think somewhere for maybe sustainable part, for sustainable peace, what we really need is also to bring these other people who think that, we should talk about these issues, although not just these issues, of course, but not like, just hold a candle or talk about Coke Studio or talk about, what is corn and culture and food, which is what our dialogues end up being. So what would you suggest in terms of, creating a space where, of course, you need common ground, but also the other things can be, discussed and maybe, shaped out. Just sort of like, how do we create that space where, we can move beyond just talking about the nicer things and actually also discuss how we can together solve the issues that remain. And it's pretty much the same issues on both sides.
I think that's an interesting question, and I don't know if I have sufficient answers, but I can only rephrase the question and add to the question itself. What you really brought out a very interesting and important point, which is that when we are talking about dialogue, between communities, between societies, between countries, across continents, most of the time our very conception of dialogue is based upon similarity, as you're trying to point out, which is that our food is similar, our clothes are similar. Okay, religion may be different, but language is similar. So the very question of dialogue is principally founded on an equality of what? Which is an equality. We are equals because we have these certain traits, certain objectifiable traits, certain identifiable traits, which seem to be applying to people on both sides of the divide of a community, of a border, of land or whatever. So I think the very idea of a conversation first needs a common ground, right? I think there's something to that as well. I'm not saying that Coke Studio and all is something which we can do away with. I mean, but I think the most substantive question is that enough? And I think somewhere within the inability to have a conversation across borders is, I'm using a Gandhian frame over here. So again, if I were to rigidly apply a Gandhian framework from what I've told you, which has actually also been developed by a scholar called Ajay Skaria. I mean, he writes in a very complex way, but these are also, a lot of it is coming from his work. So I don't want to take credit for something that somebody else has done. But I do want to say that if you were to apply this principle over here, one reason why conversation, if you apply a Gandhian expectation on this framework, one reason why these conversations have not been working, in spite of this shared common ground, in spite of all of these platforms where, World Social Forum, what have you, where people actually meet, is precisely because we are not able to see the differences between us, right? It's because we are not acknowledging the differences, because we are only wanting to see the similarities, right? But we're not acknowledging the larger being behind that similarity is different also. And unless and until we acknowledge that difference, how can we have a conversation? How will that person feel that they're being taken seriously by you if they feel that a huge part of their existence is not acknowledged by you, right? So I think that's, so therefore, with the equality of what can only work so far until such time as an equality of who has to come in, who are you, right? So a huge part of the idea of the exercise of sharing space and time with somebody in a dialogue space is that let's just not see what you really are, right? And so in the process, then you suddenly confront that difference, and then we want to shut our eyes and our ears. I don't want to deal with that. I can't believe that you're so different from me, right? And I think maybe that's one reason why we are not able to make much progress, because I don't think implicitly anywhere, even in the most, be it, whichever end of the spectrum, political spectrum you look at, be it antagonism or be it friendship between these two societies, they're basically, both sides are only working on the idea of commonality, right? There is no friendship of difference over here. There is no possibility of an equality of difference, that I'm equal to you because I'm different from you, right? But you are like me because you're similar to me, but not the question of like, hey, we are different and we can be equals and friends, which is not a border and boundary conflict alone, but it could also be an internal condition in society, right? That like between groups of different faiths, right? That we are not willing to confront that question of difference, and who has the bandwidth, who has the time. I don't want to get into this. I mean, there are many ways in which, for justifiable reasons, we are not able to go down that path. But conversation and understanding on critical matters that affect all our lives, a border conflict, it can only go so far, right? If it's just going to be about a shared past. So I don't know. That's what the Gandhian framework would perhaps point us towards. Yeah.
Thank you for that answer. It was really interesting. So there is a question in the chat. There's a couple of questions in the chat. The last one is from Charu, and she asked, how can the idea of vulnerability be applicable to a group dialogue? Further, how do you see this taking place in contemporary times when countries are more bound to advocate their own interests?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously a difficult thing, but let's just not start, for instance, and this is take a completely opposite approach over here. I mean, the question is framed in a way in which we hear it very often, which is, it's a realist's question. The person, Charu, is a realist, right? When she's asking that, okay, that's all very fine. But this is how things actually are, right? We have strong, bounded territorial notions of who we are. And we're locked in, we have massive armies, we have, territorial claims. Can't, geopolitics and real world politics, this is not a way to actually engage. I don't think one can discount that wholly. I mean, I'm not sort of saying that that's something that, is just, we can dismiss that. But I'm saying we can also take a slightly different kind of a realism, right? Which is also a reality. We are living in a time, and we are entering into times where conflict is going to grow. It doesn't look like conflict is going to become any less. Conflicts over resources, conflicts with climate change, new vulnerabilities coming up with climate change, right? This is what we do in our studio in Ambedkar University. We're working on climate change and housing, right? And how natural disasters, for instance, will create climate refugees. There will be people who will be rendered stateless, if not on account of political strife, but perhaps on account of natural disasters, right? We already are seeing massive surges in people sort of becoming refugees and traveling to different distant locations, looking for places to stay, right? Now, it is in those circumstances, we can securitize our countries with our borders in whatever way we want. But it is likely that for the next many decades, every one country is going to face, like Italy, for instance, routinely faces an ethical question about what to do with all of these people who are actually coming on these boats from the African subcontinent, desperate enough to even drown in that crossing, right, in the most inhuman conditions. And it really goes to the moral or ethical core of any society, where they have to reach for religion itself to answer these questions of what do we do, right? We're a tiny country. We have our own territorial and sovereign interests in mind, but what must we do when we are facing so much human suffering in front of us? We cannot turn our faces away, right? Many societies will face these questions, right? People running away from conflict in India, people running away from conflict to India, people running away from conflict in, let's say, South Africa, people running away to South Africa from some other country. These are things that are constantly going to confront us. That is another realism. And in the face of that, this notion of territoriality and sovereignty, while it will endure, it will also be called upon on individuals to actually not just think in terms of what, but in terms of who. Because if you reverted to the language of what, then you're only going to revert to the language of citizenship, right? But then we are going to be faced with the who question all the time, right? Where you will have to think of somebody's life not because of citizenship, because they are not citizens of your country, but because they are human beings, because they are who, right? That's another realism. So I'm not denying the question that Charu was asking. I'm reverting it and making it into a question for Charu. What are we going to do in the next 20 years when this question will come to us? Will we simply revert to the language of citizenship? Will you or I be able to think of the security of the greatest number, our own people first, right? And again, I don't claim to have answers. I'm only saying these are questions that are bound to come to us very soon. In the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, a lot of suffering is going to happen. And there, the more we invest in trying to ask ourselves these questions, I think the better prepared we may be. Well, if it's so be it, you say that I don't have more space in my country. I don't want more people in. As a society, we make that decision, but we should at least have a dialogue on that, right? Not just blindly say that because what applies today may not apply tomorrow. I think these are very important questions because lives are at stake, right? Lives of non-citizens. That's all I could say on that front. But I'm not denying what Charu was saying. I'm just saying this is also a reality.
Right. I think Sabha has shared something on the chat box. And they're saying liberals around the world have often taken a safe position at critical moments in radical issues. In this way, they end up letting go of an opportunity to bring about a change, much of the time for the fear that it entails violence to bring about the change. When violence comes from dominant, overruling power machinery, liberals have little to offer apart from criticism and curse. In this scenario, will conservatives or organic intellectuals using Gramscian terminology like Che Guevara, Franz Fanon, Ali Shariati, or Gandhi, not the only option to fall back on for cornered group? Does liberalism then lose relevance in such radical space and time?
I think no. I mean, that's a very big question. Liberalism has its flaws. I don't think it's perfect in any sense. And as I was just telling you, there's a left critique of liberalism, a very strong left critique of liberalism, that liberalism leads ultimately to the securitization not just of rights, it leads to the securitization of capitalism. Capital itself gets securitized. Capital becomes invulnerable because liberalism protects capitalism. That's one way of looking at how people criticize. Liberalism also can inadvertently lead to majoritarianism, right? Because it is protecting the will of the majority, right? That also sometimes starts happening in certain societies. So there are many ways in which one can be critical of it in that sense. But I think with every question of violence, in terms of the liberal aversion to violence or the illiberal aversion to violence, if you were to say Gandhi is not a liberal by any stretch of imagination, he's a conservative, but he is against violence. There are many difficult questions about violence, and violence, of course, always is never too far from the word responsibility, right? Because I mean, if you see those who justify violence, for instance. By the way, I'm not a political scientist. Okay, so I'm also stretching my own thinking here. I'm an architectural historian, as incredible as that might sound. I'm coming from a very different perspective, but I'm also trying to learn. I'm always a student, so I also try and keep my eyes and ears open. But I think the question of violence, as I said, is never too far from the question of responsibility, and part of the idea is that one of the, let's say, the utilitarian conception, if you were to say, as the greatest good of the greatest number, right? It's almost like it sounds like so many violent people can actually use that justification, right? You say that, look, it helps to be violent because ultimately greatest good of the greatest number, right? So sorry, a little bit of violence has to be done, but it's for the greatest good of the greatest number. And that's how a utilitarian can go to sleep, perhaps, after having done something terribly violent for the sake of the greatest good of the greatest number. But it just so happens that violence doesn't go away, at least historically, it never really has. I mean, extreme moments of extreme violence, collective violence, there is very little evidence to suggest that it has not haunted people for generations. Right? There's very little evidence of it. I've not seen any, actually. It survives. The memory of violence survives, right? Which is where we develop our modern conceptions of responsibility also. That because we have witnessed violence, in South Asia, we have witnessed terrible violence at the moment of the founding of these two significant nation states. Who can say that we don't know that violence? It reaches us every day in different forms, in the very abuse we hear on the streets, in the very way in which people speak, right? That trauma still endures, right? It's been so many years, decades. It's not gone. So empirically, for one, I'm not prepared to say that violence doesn't endure, right? And because violence stays in collective memory, it produces the idea of responsibility. Who is accountable for this, right? That violence is, if violence is something that is not, violence is, there is a cause and effect relationship, that violence is caused, right? It may be a just cause, but it is caused. And therefore, insofar as it has been caused, there is a causal agent, and we wish to pin responsibility on that person. And entire generations can go by, and you can still be looking to pin responsibility on somebody for that suffering that it has unleashed, right? So you might have been a utilitarian when you say for the greatest good of the greatest number, some violence has to happen. But try telling that to the person, who actually 2 generations down the road is still trying to look for somebody to pin the violence on. Now, I think that's the difficulty about violence, right? So, so now what we need to understand then is when we actually try to understand the liberal notion of responsibility, and if there's like a beyond liberal notion of responsibility. And I think these are the realms, insofar as we want to talk about violence in this specific framework, is what we'll have to think about. And I think I'd recommend reading somebody like Hannah Arendt and Albert Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, where Hannah Arendt actually comes as a part of the prosecution, if I'm not mistaken, and Adolf Eichmann, I think, sorry, mixing up his name. But you should look at that, because I think there the question of responsibility is very strongly taken up. That it's captured in a book called The Banality of Evil. You can also see the film. So I don't again claim to have answers to this question. I can only say that we need to make ourselves aware of the dimension of responsibility with violence. And I think then perhaps also engage with all of these thinkers, with Fanon, with Gramsci. Yeah. Any other questions?
I think Pragya says that the film is there and she will share with everyone.
I haven't seen the film, but I've read portions of Arendt's text, and I don't know how great the film is, but I'm sure it actually engages with this theme, because it's a very tough question, right? Because she's actually saying that this man who has really helped so many human beings die, she's talking about, is he responsible for what happened? And at one level, she's also trying to suggest that perhaps he is not responsible wholly, right? And that's actually the paradoxical understanding that she comes at. And I think it's very important to know why that happens. Why does she take that position? Herself being a Jew, herself having fled Nazi Germany, what really happened? What made her take this position? And she's coming at it very rationally, right? It's another thing that ultimately she does advocate for his execution, and but she separates that issue from responsibility. And so, it really comes down to this question of evil, right? We're actually talking about violence of that scale. We are trying to look at something like a category called evil, right? So when we say evil, somebody is evil because their deeds are evil, right? So in the Indian context, for instance, you actually see Avara. You should see that film, right? Pedaish or Parvarish. These are 2 categories that come up in that film. So when Raj Kapoor is actually being held to trial in the end of the film, and his own father is actually the judge, right? The part of the conversation is, did Raj Kapoor commit these these crimes because he is, because of his birth, or because of his, upbringing, right? And the judge is his father. So if you were to go by the birth angle, then he couldn't have possibly done these things, because if the judge's son would probably not do something so horrible. But if you were to look at it from a parvarish perspective, then you blame the upbringing, right? But what about the question of responsibility over there? So in every such situation, we are always trying to think beyond the idea of evil, which is that evil means that somebody is doing it because it's a free act. It is not attributable to anything before. It's not like Eichmann did not send so many Jews to the gas chambers because he was acting on some principle, but he was purely evil as a human being unto himself. It was a free act, right? So the notion of freedom there also comes in this notion of radical evil, right? But what Arendt is saying is that there is perhaps no such thing as pure evil, right? And she's trying to actually, because the trial is whether you're an evil person, right? When she's saying evil the book is called Banality of Evil, right? Where she's saying evil is not this black hole, this black box which you can't open. That evil also can be actually traced to some kind of social conditioning, right? So, and I think that's where, when we're also talking about violence, everybody who's reverting to violence is not probably doing it with evil thoughts, which is like, it's not tied into I'm violent because I'm an evil person, but there is some rationale. As I said, greatest good for the greatest number. Now, so we have to engage with those conceptual complexes, those thought clusters which are producing that kind of violence. And again, of course, I mean, this is moving out the mandate of the conversation, but I just thought I'd try and sort of draw your attention to Hannah Arendt, because I think she's a very interesting thinker in this matter. If you are thinking about questions on violence, that you must read, or at least look into what Arendt has to say. Yeah.
All right. So just check the chat. There was also someone, okay, Khan says there was also a great movie that's about the special police force, which can see people with technological devices.
Oh yeah, so Minority Report. Yeah, I haven't seen it, but I've seen the video cassette. I remember seeing it. It's that kind of idea of thought policing in a liberal state that should not ideally happen, because you should have the right to your own thoughts. So therefore, it infringes on some basic sort of key notion of privacy, right? It's really entering into your head is actually trying to, So there you go. Liberalism at least would provide you with some kind of securitization against that kind of a dystopian world. Yes, I haven't read this one, but I probably should.
Right. So there were also questions during the lecture. So to start with Sakshi's question, which is, doesn't Swaraj stand for self-government, self-raj? Gandhi staunchly believed in self-rule for every individual without any need of third party for directions in governance, which also gets related to anarchy at point. How can we relate Gandhi with liberalism with relation to constitution?
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to say, that so here's a person, when you say Swaraj, right? So the word Swar, which sort of comes in Swaraj, the word Raj is again, some form of sovereignty, some kingly figure, right? So the Swar means self-rule, right? So in that sense, on the one hand, it can come back to the notion of parliamentary democracy, which Gandhi's actually severely criticizing for a huge part of his political career. In fact, in Hind Swaraj, you will actually see a criticism of the parliamentary form of democracy. And so the idea of the Swa is not a reference to building your own parliament. I mean, at least that's what the text seems to be saying. So, which means then he is perhaps talking about some notion of the self or freedom, if you will, which is closer to that godlike notion of freedom, which is not governed by any pre-existing principle, right? And so he's basically saying that every human being has that potential ability to become a god. right? To not be governed by the rules of others, right? That's potentially what he's saying. But you can certainly see that the way in which that text is actually structured, it is between an editor and a reader, right? So he's actually, and that also the person whom he's supposedly talking to is also Pranjeevan Mehta. There's some speculation of that. But the point is that the reader is saying that we want freedom from British rule, and we want our own rule, right? And therefore pointing towards parliamentary democracy. And so Gandhi's response is that is, you want to get rid of the tiger, but you want to keep the stripes and the claws of the tiger, right? Which means that you want to keep that very idea of parliamentary democracy in place, representative or republican democracy, as we sort of talk about. So part of the idea is that he's saying, but that's still not freedom in the Swa sense, that it would still mean that you are tying your notion of freedom to a concept and a principle, right, or law. And as I was saying, his whole entire political discourse is that let's not go to the lawyers, let's not go to the court, let's have aapas mein baat karna hai, right? So you can begin to then see that the entire mature political philosophy that he's actually trying to, the mature portions of his political philosophy are going into this conversation on having a dialogue on a Swa which is not beholden to law, right? And there's also a big suspicion of law. You have to understand, because the British Empire it was the rule of law. And it is through the rule of law that they governed, that they colonized, right? So in that sense, Gandhi's surely he's anarchic. I mean, who can deny that? But my point is that we also have to see it in context, right? Gandhi is not coming from nowhere. They've actually realized how the rule of law is what has been used to justify colonialism. So to that end, if he's saying that like the Swa must, not include this notion of law, even though he's a lawyer, he's probably doing it with a sense of great resentment towards law, because it is law which has actually produced this kind of bondage, right, of becoming a colony. So I think you have to see it in that context. But whether that means we let go of law completely, I don't think like that's what would be mature. Rather, to actually understand how we actually work with law to actually make it more responsive, and to see what law blinds us to, and to not close our eyes to that portion, the differences, right? And because law will not help us in solving those problems, is what the message comes as from there.
Right. So there's one more question that came during the lecture, which was, is it that the idea of liberalism is in downfall and the ideas of realism is at work in many parts of the world as it is used to be in pre-World War time? I think.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No. I thought it was in relation to something during the lecture. That's all.
Yeah. No, I think like I'm just saying that this idea of realism is also partly very much political within the tradition of liberalism. It's not outside. There's a notion of realism as in like populism, perhaps, if you want to take into account. They're also saying that we are trying to go with the will of the people, right? So what is populism, right? Any populist politics that says, imagine abstract country. Again, I don't want to get specifically to any one country because I feel we don't want to make ourselves too vulnerable. But I'm just saying that I'll say that the idea of an abstract country where somebody says there's a leader or a party or an important social force which comes into the public sphere and says, look, we serve you, right? We are your representatives. You tell us what you want, we'll do exactly that, right? Now, the public ends up sort of saying the most bizarre things in that abstract country, right? Somebody says that, we need we need potatoes thrown on the road, right? We need pumpkins put on the tops of roofs, some strange demand that this public makes, right? And this person says that's the will of the people and it'll be done, right? And so therefore they grow in power because they're doing exactly what people want, right? But one part of that way in which they're approaching things is they're saying that we're respecting the will of the people, right? What are they saying then in the process? They're saying that, look, we, your leaders, we don't have a will of our own. You, the people, it's your will, right? For the people. We will do this for the people. So they do something for the people. So the idea is that you are in some ways saying that the will of the people is free. It's free from your will as a leader. So even here, a notion of freedom is at work, right? And so you can begin to see how a lot of political rhetoric falls into these categories, which we have discussed over here, right? And it's not surprising that a lot of populism comes up in liberal societies only, right? Because the emphasis, the idea of the will of a person and the will of a people has so much power over here that our entire political edifice is built on that foundation, right? So we will do anything to protect that will, right? The only difference is where, in the conventional sense, liberalism is talking about the wills of individual persons. A populist conception of some core, transformed idea in liberalism would be the will of collectivities, the wills of majorities, right? Saying you want to protect your will, right? Our task as a government is to protect your will. So I'm just saying that you can very easily see this language of will, which is there fundamentally as a part of liberalism, can be very quickly morphed into the language of the majority, the will of the majority. So I feel like to that extent, one of the reasons why, if you actually see in Gandhi's own critique of liberal democracy, this is a huge part that the majorities might actually take over. And that is something that he does explicitly mention. So it's another thing that he himself was pursuing a majority religion, but it is the case that in his writing he does mention this. So I think that's where I'd put it. I would not say that this notion of realism is different from the core ideas from which liberalism is stemming. It's not like we have entered into some new phase. We're just looking at a transformed situation within the same society and within the same political framework, but a very, very radically transformed one, of course. Yeah.
Right. So does anyone else have any questions? Oh, you could type it in the chat box or you could raise your hand.
Great. I think there's enough food for thought there. So
yeah. All right. Thank you so much for this session. I'm sure all of us got something to think about. So I would like to thank you from the In Dialogue Foundation. Sure. So yeah, thank you.